The alarms were screaming before I even understood what was happening, and 300 pounds of scaled muscle and claws were airborne, heading straight for Lieutenant Morrison's throat. I had exactly 2 seconds to make a choice that would either save lives or end my career. And the only thing I could think about was the terrified silver eyes of the alien girl clutching that ridiculous Earth-made blanket like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Maybe it was. "Stand down," I roared, throwing myself between Morrison and the alpha cub, feeling the heat of its breath on my face as it skidded to a halt inches from my chest, its triple-jointed legs trembling with barely contained rage. The medical bay had gone silent except for the low, rumbling growl emanating from not just one but all 6 of the cubs surrounding the recovery bed, their bioluminescent stripes pulsing angry crimson in the sterile white light. Morrison was frozen, his hand still extended toward the blanket, his face pale as he finally understood just how catastrophically he'd miscalculated. The girl, Lyra, she'd asked us to call her, though that wasn't her real name because human tongues couldn't shape the musical tones of her native language, was pressed against the headboard, her pointed ears flattened against her platinum hair, her normally luminescent skin gone dim with fear. I'd seen that look before, 3 weeks ago, when we'd found her in the wreckage of the unmarked transport vessel drifting through the Kronos belt. And I'd sworn to myself I'd never let her feel that afraid again. A promise that was looking increasingly stupid, given that I was currently the only thing standing between station security and 6 very angry, very protective alien predators that had imprinted on her like she was their mother. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without context. And context is exactly what I'd been trying to get Morrison to understand for the past 72 hours. My name is Captain Sarah Chen, head of security for Deep Space Station Artemis. And my job description definitely did not include negotiating interspecies adoption protocols or explaining alien bonding rituals to bureaucrats who thought protocol mattered more than common sense. 3 weeks ago, we'd received a distress beacon from an unregistered vessel that turned out to be a smuggler's ship, though we didn't know that initially. What we found inside changed everything. The cargo hold was a nightmare of cages and containment fields. Dozens of species crammed together in conditions that violated every civilized law in known space. And in the center of it all was Lyra, unconscious and curled around 6 newly hatched cubs of a species I'd never seen before. The smugglers were long gone, probably jumped ship when their life support started failing, leaving their merchandise to die. We brought everyone aboard, got medical teams working on the survivors, and that's when things got complicated. The cubs, as we started calling them, wouldn't let anyone near Lyra, not medical staff, not xenobiologists, not even the diplomatic team that arrived 2 days later. They were apex predators from a planet we later identified as Theraxis Prime, a death world where everything evolved to kill everything else. And these 6 babies could already move faster than human eyes could track, had claws that could shred playsteel, and possessed an intelligence that made them terrifyingly unpredictable. But they treated Lyra like she was sacred. When she finally woke up, 4 days after we brought her in, the first thing she did was ask if the cubs were safe. Her voice rough from disuse, but her concern absolutely genuine. That's when I started to like her, really like her, in a way that was probably inappropriate for a security officer assigned to her case, but felt inevitable anyway. She wasn't just beautiful, though she absolutely was, with features that looked almost human, except for those elegant, pointed ears and skin that seemed to glow softly in low light. She was fierce and funny and determined, even though she'd been through hell. And when she smiled at me for the first time, thanking me for saving them, I felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with professional duty. Through a combination of translation software and her surprising grasp of basic standard, we pieced together her story. She was a conservationist from Lyra, a peaceful world known for its environmental protection efforts, who'd been captured while trying to document illegal wildlife trafficking routes. The smugglers had thrown her in with the cubs after their actual mother had died in transit, probably hoping she could keep them alive long enough to sell. Instead, she'd bonded with them. Lyra explained that she'd used a technique from her planet, something about shared body heat and scent markers, wrapping herself and the cubs in anything soft she could find, singing to them in her native language, letting them learn her as safe. By the time we found them, the cubs believed she was their pack, and she believed they were her responsibility. a responsibility she took with deadly seriousness. The blanket became central to everything. And honestly, I almost missed the significance at first. It was just a standard issue emergency thermal blanket, the kind we kept in every rescue kit, metallic silver on one side and plain blue on the other, nothing special. But to Lyra and the cubs, it was everything. She'd wrapped them in it during those first terrifying hours in the cargo hold, kept them warm when the life support was failing. And now, weeks later, she still kept it close, draped over her shoulders or folded on her lap. The cubs would curl up on it when they slept, would calm immediately when she wrapped it around herself, would become visibly agitated when it was out of sight. Our xenobiologist, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, explained that for pack predators from high-stress environments, scent and tactile association were crucial for bonding. And that blanket was literally soaked in the combined scent of Lyra and the cubs, making it a physical symbol of their family unit. Remove the blanket, and you weren't just taking away fabric, you were threatening the pack structure itself. I'd tried to explain this to Morrison, to the diplomatic team, to everyone who kept insisting that Lyra needed to be properly processed and the cubs needed to be transferred to a xenobiology facility. But nobody wanted to listen to the security officer, who was clearly too emotionally invested in the case. They weren't wrong about the emotional investment, but they were dead wrong about the rest. Everything came to a head on day 21. Which was when the diplomatic corps decided they'd waited long enough for Lyra to be compliant with standard procedures. Morrison, who was technically my superior officer during diplomatic operations, informed me that morning that he'd be conducting a proper medical examination of our guest, which would require removing non-sterile materials from the medical bay, including her blanket. I told him it was a catastrophically bad idea. I explained the bonding, the pack dynamics, the fact that the cubs were already stressed because Lyra was confined to the medical bay for observation. I might as well have been talking to a wall. Captain Chen, he'd said in that condescending tone that made me want to punch him, I understand you've formed an attachment to the subject, but we have protocols for a reason. The alien girl will survive without her security blanket, and we need to establish that humans are the authority here, not a bunch of overgrown lizards. That's when I knew we were in trouble, because anyone who called those cubs overgrown lizards fundamentally didn't understand what we were dealing with. And fundamental misunderstanding leads to fatal mistakes. I'd tried to be there when Morrison made his move, but he'd deliberately scheduled it during my shift rotation, sending me on a priority security check of a section that definitely didn't need checking. By the time I realized what was happening and sprinted back to the medical bay, the situation was already critical. The cubs had been dozing, 3 on the bed with Lyra and 3 on the floor nearby, when Morrison and 2 security officers I didn't recognize entered with what he probably thought was appropriate authority. Lyra had been reading on a datapad I'd lent her, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in days, her silver hair falling over one shoulder, that soft glow to her skin that I'd learned meant she was content. Morrison didn't even have the courtesy to explain himself, just walked up to the bed and reached for the blanket folded at her feet. That's when everything went wrong. The cubs reacted instantly, their bioluminescent stripes flaring from calm blue to warning yellow to attack imminent red in the span of a heartbeat, their bodies going from relaxed to combat ready with terrifying speed. Lyra had tried to intervene, holding up her hands and making soothing sounds in her language. But Morrison, in his infinite wisdom, interpreted her protective gesture as resistance and grabbed the blanket anyway, yanking it away from her reaching fingers. The alpha cub, the largest of the 6, and the one with distinctive scarring on his shoulder, launched himself at Morrison with a shriek that set off every alarm in the bay. And that's when I burst through the door and did something that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, probably both. I threw myself into the path of a predator that could have disemboweled me with one swipe, using nothing but voice commands in a language I barely spoke, and the desperate hope that the cubs had learned to associate me with Lyra, with safety, with pack. Casher, I shouted, using the word. Lyra had taught me that meant something like family stop or pack hold, and the alpha cub's claws stopped an inch from my face, his entire body quivering with the effort of overriding his attack instinct. The other 5 were surrounding us now, creating a living barrier between Lyra and the security team. And I could hear Morrison's harsh breathing behind me, could feel the tension in the room, like a physical thing ready to snap. Very slowly, I lowered my hand and placed it on the alpha cub's head, feeling the heat of his scales, the rapid flutter of his triple heartbeat, the way he was shaking with adrenaline and protective rage. "It's okay," I said softly, not sure if I was talking to the cub or Lyra or myself. "Nobody's going to hurt her. Nobody's going to take anything. I promise." Lyra's voice cut through the tension, speaking in standard for Morrison's benefit, though her accent was thicker than usual, a sign I'd learned, meant she was fighting strong emotions. "The blanket is not just cloth, Lieutenant. To my cubs, to me, it is our bond made physical. To remove it is to say we are no longer pack, no longer safe, no longer alive together." Her silver eyes found mine, and there was something in that look that made my heart clench. Trust and fear, and something else I didn't want to name because naming it would make this whole situation even more complicated. On Theraxis, on their world, when a pack member dies, their scent marker is removed from the den. You reached for our marker, and they believed you were declaring me dead, declaring the pack broken. It is, in their understanding, a death threat. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Morrison's sharp intake of breath as he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd almost caused. The cubs were still tense, still ready to fight, but they were looking at Lyra now, waiting for her signal. And she was looking at me like I was the only thing in the universe she could count on. Maybe I was. Getting everyone to stand down took another 20 minutes of careful negotiation, with me acting as interpreter between Lyra's explanation of cub psychology and Morrison's slow acceptance that he'd nearly triggered an interspecies incident that would have ended in bloodshed. The blanket was returned with what I can only describe as ceremonial care, Morrison placing it in Lyra's hands like it was made of explosive material, which, in a way, it was. The moment her fingers closed around the fabric, the change in the cubs was miraculous. Their stripes fading from red to yellow to calm blue, their postures relaxing, several of them making a rumbling sound that Dr. Tanaka later told me was analogous to purring. Lyra wrapped the blanket around her shoulders with shaking hands, and two of the younger cubs immediately crawled into her lap, seeking comfort, while the alpha cub that had nearly killed Morrison settled at her feet like a guardian statue, his eyes still tracking the lieutenant with predatory focus. Morrison left with his tail between his legs, taking his security team with him. And suddenly the medical bay was quiet, except for the soft breathing of the cubs and the rapid beating of my heart. "Thank you, Sarah," Lyra said quietly, and hearing my name in her accent did something to me that I really didn't have time to analyze. I sat down on the edge of her bed, suddenly exhausted, and realized I was shaking almost as badly as she was. "That was the stupidest thing I've ever done," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "I could have been killed. You could have been killed. The cubs would have been destroyed as dangerous animals, and we'd have an interstellar incident that would take decades to resolve." She reached out and took my hand, her skin warm and smooth, that subtle glow brightening slightly at the contact. "But you did it anyway. You chose trust over protocol, chose us over safety. Why?" It was a fair question, and I wasn't entirely sure I knew the answer. Or maybe I knew, but wasn't ready to say it out loud. "Because," I started, then stopped, trying to find words that wouldn't sound like a security captain falling for someone she was supposed to be protecting. "Because you matter. Because they matter. Because some things are more important than following orders." Her smile was small but genuine, and she squeezed my hand gently. "On my world, we have a saying, the heart knows pack before the mind knows reason. I think your heart knew." Sarah Chen. The next few days were a turning point in ways I hadn't expected. Because Morrison's spectacularly failed intervention had actually accomplished something useful. It had forced the diplomatic corps to take Lyra's situation seriously. Suddenly, people were interested in understanding cub bonding dynamics, in respecting alien cultural practices, in finding solutions that didn't involve separation or containment. Dr. Tanaka became our advocate, presenting research on Theraxis pack structures and the psychological damage that would result from breaking an established bond. The station commander, Captain Rodriguez, who'd been mostly hands-off until the incident, personally reviewed the case and came down firmly on the side of keeping Lyra and the cubs together. And I became something I'd never expected to be. Lyra's official liaison and the primary contact for what they were now calling the Theraxis Integration Project. It meant I spent hours every day with her. And honestly, those were the best hours of my life. We talked about everything, her world with its massive conservation parks and bioluminescent forests. My childhood on Earth and why I'd joined station security. The dreams we'd both had before everything went sideways. The cubs grew comfortable with me, the alpha even letting me scratch behind his ear ridges, which Lyra said was a sign of profound trust. And through it all, that blanket remained central, always within reach. Always treated with reverence, a symbol of survival and connection that meant more than any official document or diplomatic agreement. What I didn't expect was how quickly my feelings would deepen, or how obvious they'd become to everyone, except, apparently, me. Dr. Tanaka cornered me one day in the station commissary, giving me a knowing look over her coffee. "You're falling for her," she said, not unkindly. "Actually, I think you've already fallen. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I tried to deny it, cited professional boundaries and the complexity of the situation, but Tanaka just laughed. "Sarah, you literally threw yourself in front of an apex predator for her. I think we're past professional boundaries." She had a point, but that didn't make it less complicated. Lyra was technically under station protection, possibly traumatized from her ordeal, dealing with massive uncertainty about her future. And I was the security captain assigned to her case, a position of power that made any personal relationship ethically questionable at best. Except every time I saw her, every time she smiled at me, or took my hand, or asked my opinion on something, I felt like maybe ethics were less important than the simple truth that we understood each other in a way I'd never experienced with anyone else. The breakthrough came 5 weeks after the blanket incident, when the Ellerin government finally responded to our diplomatic inquiries. Lyra was officially listed as missing and presumed dead, a casualty of the smuggling rings she'd been investigating, and her family had already held memorial services. The news hit her hard, and I found her in the medical bay late one night, curled up under that precious blanket, with the cubs piled around her, tears streaming down her glowing cheeks. I didn't ask permission, just climbed onto the bed beside her and pulled her into my arms, letting her cry against my shoulder while the cubs watched with solemn, intelligent eyes. "They think I'm dead," she whispered between sobs. "Everyone I love thinks I'm gone, and I can't even tell them I'm alive because the communication channels aren't secure. Because the smuggling networks might track the signal. Because, I held her tighter, feeling her pain like it was my own. "Then we'll find a way to tell them safely," I promised. "I will personally fly to Alara if I have to, and knock on your family's door." "You are not alone, Lyra. Not anymore." That night changed everything between us, an unspoken acknowledgement that this was more than professional concern or friendly support. This was something deep and real and terrifying in its intensity. We didn't talk about it directly because talking would have meant dealing with all the complicated logistics and ethical questions, and neither of us was ready for that conversation. Instead, we existed in a strange liminal space where I was officially her liaison, but unofficially, so much more. Where she would reach for my hand during difficult meetings, and I would find excuses to extend my shifts so I could spend more time with her. Where the cubs started treating me like pack because they could sense what Lyra felt, and what she felt was written all over her face every time she looked at me. The station crew started joking about it, good-natured teasing about Captain Chen and her alien princess. But I didn't care, because when Lyra laughed at something I said or fell asleep with her head on my shoulder during a movie night in the medical bay, nothing else seemed to matter. The situation with the cubs complicated things in unexpected ways because they were growing at an alarming rate, already twice the size they'd been when we rescued them. And Dr. Tanaka estimated they'd reach full maturity in another 3 months. That meant decisions had to be made about their future, and by extension, Lyra's future. The diplomatic corps wanted to send them to a xenobiology research facility, well-meaning scientists who promised proper care but couldn't guarantee they'd stay together or that Lyra could stay with them. The Theraxis government, newly contacted and deeply suspicious of humans after decades of poaching on their world, wanted the cubs returned immediately and didn't particularly care what happened to Lyra. And Lyra herself was caught in the middle, torn between what was best for the cubs and her own desire for agency after being a victim for so long. We spent hours discussing options, running scenarios, looking for solutions that seemed increasingly impossible. It was during one of these late-night strategy sessions that she asked me the question I'd been dreading. "If you could choose, Sarah, what would you want? If there were no protocols or politics or practical concerns, what would you choose for us?" I looked at her sitting cross-legged on the medical bay bed, the blanket draped over her shoulders like a royal mantle, 3 sleeping cubs using her lap as a pillow, her silver hair catching the low light, and her eyes full of hope and fear in equal measure, and I couldn't lie to her. "I'd choose you here," I said quietly. "On Artemis, or wherever I am. I'd choose the cubs, healthy and happy, wild but safe. I'd choose mornings where I wake up knowing you're okay, and evenings where we argue about what to watch, and moments like this where I can just be honest about the fact that I'm completely, irrevocably in love with you, and have been probably since you first woke up and asked about the cubs before yourself." The silence that followed my confession felt like falling, terrifying and exhilarating. And then Lyra was moving, carefully displacing sleeping cubs and crossing the bed to take my face in her hands, her skin warm and glowing brighter than I'd ever seen. "On my world," she said softly, "we believe that love is not about finding someone perfect, but finding someone whose imperfections fit with yours like interlocking pieces of a whole. Your recklessness fits my caution. Your strength fits my compassion. Your human heart fits my alien soul. I choose you too, Sarah Chen, and I have been choosing you every day since you stood between me and danger without hesitation." When she kissed me, it was gentle and certain, tasting like the mint tea she'd been drinking, and feeling like coming home to a place I'd never been. And I understood in that moment why people did stupid things for love. Why they threw themselves in front of predators and defied orders and risked everything for one person. Because this connection, this feeling of rightness, despite all the wrongness of the circumstances, was worth any risk. The cubs stirred around us, the alpha making a curious chirping sound, and when we pulled apart, Lyra was laughing softly, tears on her cheeks, but joy in her eyes. "They approve," she said. "In pack dynamics, the alpha's acceptance of a new member is crucial, and Cash has been trying to include you in the pack for weeks. I think he knew before we did." I scratched the alpha cub, Cash apparently, behind his ear ridges, earning a rumbling purr. "Smart cub," I murmured, and Lyra's answering smile could have powered the entire station. The solution, when it came, was both simpler and more complicated than anyone expected. And it came from the most unlikely source, Morrison. 3 days after Lyra and I acknowledged what was between us, the lieutenant requested a private meeting, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I've been thinking about the cub situation," he started, not quite meeting my eyes, "and I realized that my actions nearly caused a disaster. I want to make it right." He'd been researching, it turned out, digging through interstellar law and diplomatic precedent, and he'd found something interesting. A provision in the Sentient Species Protection Act that allowed for what was essentially interspecies fostering in cases where separation would cause psychological harm to endangered juveniles. The Theraxis cubs qualified as endangered. Lyra was already established as their primary bond, and with proper documentation and oversight, she could be granted official guardian status, which would give her legal standing to make decisions about their care and placement. The catch was that she'd need a co-sponsor, someone with standing in the station community who could vouch for her stability and commitment. And Morrison was recommending me. "You've proven you understand the situation better than anyone," he said quietly, "and you clearly care about the outcome. If you're willing to take on the responsibility, I'll push the paperwork through myself and advocate to the diplomatic corps. It's the least I can do." After nearly getting everyone killed, becoming official co-guardian of 6 apex predator cubs from a death world while navigating a brand new relationship with their beautiful alien primary guardian was possibly the most insane thing I'd ever agreed to. But I didn't hesitate for a second. The paperwork took weeks to process, requiring statements from xenobiologists, psychological evaluations, facility inspections, and more bureaucratic nonsense than should be legal. But eventually, it was approved. Lyra was granted provisional guardian status with me as her co-sponsor, and the cubs were officially remanded to our care under the oversight of station scientific teams. It meant Lyra could leave medical confinement, meant we could start building something resembling a normal life, meant the cubs could grow up in an environment that balanced socialization with their natural instincts. We converted an unused cargo bay into a habitat space, brought in environmental specialists to create proper enrichment, and suddenly, Lyra and I were co-parenting 6 increasingly large and intelligent predators, while trying to figure out what we were to each other beyond Caregivers. The answer revealed itself gradually, through 1,000 small moments. Mornings, feeding the cubs and stealing kisses between their demanding chirps. Evenings, watching Lyra teach them hunting behaviors with station-approved prey simulators while I handled the security protocols. Nights curled together on the observation deck, talking about futures that seemed increasingly possible. The blanket remained important, still kept in the habitat's central den area, where the cubs would sleep in a pile with Lyra at the center, but its meaning had evolved. It wasn't just a survival marker anymore, but a symbol of family, of the bonds we'd all formed through crisis and choice. A physical reminder that sometimes the most precious things are the simplest ones we almost lose. Lyra eventually contacted her family through secure channels, and while the reunion was tearful and complicated, they understood why she couldn't return to Lyra yet, why the cubs needed her, and why, as she told them, with me sitting beside her, holding her hand, she'd found something on this human station worth staying for. 6 months after that terrifying moment when Morrison reached for a blanket and nearly died for his ignorance, I woke up in the habitat to find Lyra watching me with those luminous silver eyes, the morning light making her glow like something from a dream. 3 cubs sprawled across my legs and the other 3 piled on her. "What are you thinking?" I asked sleepily, and she smiled that smile that still made my heart skip. "I am thinking that I was captured and lost everything, and through that loss, I found everything that matters. I am thinking that a simple blanket saved my life in more ways than one. I am thinking that the human heart is more alien and more wonderful than I ever imagined. And I am grateful every day that yours chose mine." I pulled her closer, careful not to disturb the sleeping cubs, and kissed her forehead. "The heart knows pack before the mind knows reason." I quoted her words back to her. My heart knew you were pack from the first moment, even if my mind took a while to catch up. Outside the habitat, the station was waking up, the artificial dawn brightening the corridors, the sound of morning shifts starting their rotations, the normal rhythm of life in deep space. But in our converted cargo bay, with our 6 guardian predators and our impossible love story, everything was exactly as it should be. The cubs grew, Lyra thrived, and I learned that sometimes security wasn't about following protocol, but about understanding what truly needed protecting. That sometimes love crossed species and circumstances and logic to create something entirely new. That sometimes a blanket was just a blanket, and sometimes it was everything. And that the most dangerous threats could become family, if you were brave enough to trust. When the diplomatic corps eventually asked me to write a report on the incident for training purposes, I made sure to emphasize one critical point: that understanding matters more than authority. That listening to those directly involved in a situation can prevent catastrophe. And that sometimes the barrier between life and death, between violence and peace, is as thin as a piece of cloth, and as strong as the bond it represents. Morrison read my report and submitted his own addendum, a rare public acknowledgement of error that recommended new protocols for handling bonded species and cultural sensitivity training for all diplomatic personnel. It wouldn't fix everything, wouldn't prevent all future mistakes, but it was a start, a recognition that we still had so much to learn about the universe and the beings we shared it with, and that humility in the face of that ignorance could save lives. As for Lyra and me, we built a life that defied easy categorization, neither fully human nor fully Ellerin, but something new and entirely ours. Co-parents to 6 magnificent predators who grew into their roles as ambassadors between species, partners in a relationship that challenged and fulfilled us both, and proof that sometimes the best stories are the ones that start with near disaster and end with love. The blanket, that simple emergency thermal blanket that had sparked a crisis and saved lives, remained in the habitat's den, threadbare now from years of use, patched in places where cub claws had snagged it, but still cherished, still central to the pack's sense of identity. When the cubs eventually reached maturity and were old enough to choose their own paths, 3 decided to return to Theraxis to participate in conservation efforts, while 3 chose to stay on Artemis, becoming the first of their species to work in interstellar diplomacy. And all 6 remained bonded to Lyra, to me, to the pack we'd formed in the most unlikely circumstances. And whenever they came home, whether from diplomatic missions or wilderness reserves, they'd seek out that blanket, curl up on it like they were cubs again, and remind us all that family isn't defined by biology or species or logic, but by the bonds we choose to honor, the threats we stand against together. and the simple acts of love that save us when everything else falls apart.